Thank you.
Steve Bannon, a former top advisor to President Donald Trump, was convicted of contempt of Congress for defying a subpoena from the January 6th committee.
We may have lost a battle here today, but we're not going to lose this war.
After less than 3 hours of deliberations, a jury on Friday found Bannon guilty of 2 misdemeanor counts for refusing to provide testimony or documents to the House committee investigating the violent attack on the Capitol, where Trump supporters tried to overturn the 2020 election results. The verdict marks the first successful prosecution for contempt of Congress since 1974, where each misdemeanor count is punishable by 30 days to 1 year behind bars, as well as a fine of up to $100,000. In closing arguments Friday, Bannon's defense team suggested to jurors that Bannon was a political target. The prosecutor told jurors, quote, "There is nothing political about finding out why January 6th happened and making sure it never happens again."
In the closing argument, the prosecutor missed one very important phrase, right? I stand with Trump and the Constitution, and I will never back off that, ever.
Bannon chose not to testify in the trial after the judge barred him from arguing that he believed his communications with Trump were subject to executive privilege, and from arguing that he relied on legal advice from an attorney in refusing to comply. Bannon's conviction may strengthen the January 6th committee's position as it seeks to secure testimony and documents from others in Trump's orbit.
Let the record reflect that the witnesses.
It was unpatriotic. It was un-American. We were watching the Capitol building get defaced over a lie.
Weeks of blistering testimony from the January 6th committee are taking a toll on Donald Trump's standing. That's according to a new Reuters Ipsos poll which found Republican views on Trump have darkened somewhat since the congressional hearings on the Capitol attack began 6 weeks ago. The 2-day poll, finished hours before the 8th hearing of the congressional probe, showed that 40% of Republicans now believe Trump is at least partly to blame for the deadly riot, up from 33% in a poll conducted 6 weeks ago. And yet, Trump continues to have widespread support in the Republican Party, and regularly hints he will run for president again in 2024.
Did anyone provide you with evidence of election fraud sufficient to affect the outcome of the presidential election in Arizona?
No one provided me ever such evidence.
But 6 weeks of televised hearings have made a dent in his support. Now, 1/3 of Republican respondents think Trump should not run for president again in 2024, up from a quarter who held that view in early June, when the bipartisan congressional probe began broadcasting hearings. The January 6 House Select Committee has used the hearings to build a case that Trump's efforts to overturn his defeat by Democrat Joe Biden constitute illegal conduct, and culminated with the violent attack on the Capitol. But Reuters Ipsos polling still shows many Republicans hold views at odds with the facts uncovered by congressional and criminal probes. In the latest poll, which gathered responses from 1,005 adults between July 20th and 21st, a majority of Republicans, or 55%, continue to believe the 2020 election was stolen from Trump.
Twitter reported a surprising fall in quarterly revenue on Friday, blaming a weak ad market and Elon Musk. The social media company is suing the Tesla founder for dropping his $44 billion offer to buy the company and is now preparing for a legal showdown in a trial set to begin in October. Uncertainty around the deal has worried Twitter's advertisers and caused chaos inside the company. Advertising revenue rose just 2% to $1.08 billion, missing Wall Street's expectations of $1.22 billion, according to Refinitiv IBES data. Total second quarter revenue was $1.18 billion, compared with $1.19 billion a year earlier. Analysts were expecting $1.32 billion. Monetizable daily active users, a metric closely watched by investors that measures users who see advertising on Twitter, grew 16%, but fell short of analysts' expectations by about 1 million users. Inflation pressures and fears of a recession have forced some advertisers to slash their marketing budgets, which was also wreaking havoc on other social media companies on Friday. Pinterest plunged more than 11%, Facebook owner Meta dropped more than 5%, and Google owner Alphabet fell more than 3%. At current prices, Pinterest, Meta, Snap, Alphabet, and Twitter were collectively set to lose about $42 billion in market value. Russia and Ukraine signed a landmark deal on Friday to reopen Ukrainian Black Sea ports for grain exports, raising hopes that an international food crisis aggravated by the Russian invasion can be eased. UN Chief Antonio Guterres called it an agreement for the world, aimed at restoring Ukrainian grain exports and easing Russian grain and fertilizer shipments despite Western sanctions.
This initiative must be fully implemented because the world so desperately needs it to tackle the global food crisis.
The deal ensures safe passage in and out of Odessa and 2 other Ukrainian ports in what one UN official called a de facto ceasefire. Ukraine and Russia are among the world's biggest exporters of food. A blockade of Ukraine's ports by Russia's Black Sea Fleet has hurt global supply chains. Moscow, which invaded Ukraine in February in what it called a special military operation, has denied responsibility for the food crisis. It instead blamed Western sanctions imposed for slowing its own food and fertilizer exports. The hope is Friday's landmark deal can help avert famine for tens of millions of people. It caps off 2 months of talks brokered by the UN and Turkey, a NATO member that has good relations with both Russia and Ukraine. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov highlighted its potential to help with food security.
Рассчитываем, что в предстоящий период
We hope that in the coming period, all the necessary efforts will be made for the effective implementation of these agreements. Given the significant share of Russian and Ukrainian agricultural products on global markets, ensuring their uninterrupted export meets the urgent task of maintaining food security.
Ukraine's infrastructure minister Oleksandr Kubrikov said it was made possible by recent military success.
All of this wouldn't be possible if not for the success of our armed forces and our naval forces. A particularly important moment was the liberation of Snake Island.
UN officials said the deal should be up and running within a few weeks. U.S. stocks ended lower on Friday as disappointing earnings from Snap spooked investors and shares in social media and ad tech firms dropped. The Snapchat owner posted its weakest ever quarterly sales growth as a public company, signaling advertisers had tightened their purse strings. Shares of online ad giants, including Facebook parent Meta and Google parent Alphabet, tumbled with it, weighing on the NASDAQ. Tyler Ellegard is an investment analyst at Gradient Investments.
Well, I think what you're seeing is really just a reflection of what's going on with Snapchat. And the reason stocks are reacting the way they are is because you have bigger names that have implications from what's happening there, such as Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta as well. So, it's a question of what does ad spend look like? Because if major corporations are starting to see a slowdown in purchases from consumers, the first thing they're really going to start to pull is advertising. And so we saw that with Snapchat. And so it's putting some doubt into investors right now with some of those major companies as well, like your Metas and Googles, and just trying to figure out what does the consumer look like right now and what is it going to look like going forward.
Twitter fell earlier in the day following a surprise drop in revenue, but reversed its losses. The Dow fell 0.4%, the S&P 500 dropped just under 1%, while the NASDAQ lost nearly 1.9%. Still, all 3 major indexes posted weekly gains despite Friday's losses. With 106 of the S&P 500 companies having reported earnings through Friday morning, more than 75% have topped analyst expectations, below the 81% beat rate over the past 4 quarters, according to Refinitiv data. Meta and Alphabet are set to post their earnings next week, along with mega-cap peers including Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon.com. All eyes are on the Federal Reserve's meeting and second quarter U.S. gross domestic product data next week. While the U.S. Central Bank is expected to raise interest rates by 75 basis points to curb runaway inflation, the GDP data is likely to be negative again.